There are moments in life when arrogance meets honor, and only one walks away unchanged. Today's story isn't about fame or fortune. It's about a group of school bullies who thought mocking a tomb guard would be funny. They laughed, they taunted, they pushed the line no one dares to cross. But what happened next silenced every laugh, taught a lesson they would never forget, and showed the world that respect isn't demanded, it's earned through sacrifice. This is the true story of the day school bullies tried to trip a tomb guard, and what happened next shocked everyone. There is a place in America where silence speaks louder than words, where every step is measured, and where honor stands eternal. It is the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. Here, soldiers of the old guard marched day and night, rain or shine, in heat or bitter cold, never faltering, never breaking, carrying out their sacred duty to honor those whose names we will never know, but whose sacrifice shaped the nation. For many visitors, witnessing this ceremony is a moment of reverence, a reminder that freedom comes at a price. But for some, it becomes a lesson they never expected. It was on a clear spring afternoon when a group of middle school students arrived on a field trip. Teachers guided them through the cemetery grounds, pointing out the rows upon rows of white headstones that stretched across the landscape like waves frozen in time. For some of the children, the weight of history settled quietly on their shoulders. They whispered, moved slowly, sensing that this was no ordinary field trip. But as in every group, there were a few who had not yet learned the meaning of respect. They were the ones who whispered jokes, laughed at things they didn't understand, and tried to impress each other with careless behavior. Among them were three boys who had a reputation for trouble. They had been warned countless times about their antics in school. They liked to push boundaries, to test limits, to show off at the expense of others. And on this day, in a place meant for silence and honor, they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The group approached the black mat where the guard of the tomb walks his 21 steps. The air seemed to still as the soldier, dressed in perfect uniform, marched with mechanical precision. His shoes struck the ground in sharp rhythm, his weapon held firmly on his shoulder, his gaze fixed ahead. The students lined up along the railing, some watching in awe, others distracted by their phones. The three boys, however, nudged each other, smirking. One of them whispered, "Bet I can make him flinch." Another replied, "No way, they're like robots. They don't even look at people." The third laughed and said, "Watch this. This is going to be hilarious." They waited for the guard to approach the far end of his 21 steps. As he pivoted with perfect precision, they timed their move. One of the boys stuck his foot slightly past the railing, pretending as if he would trip the soldier as he marched by. Another made a sudden loud cough, followed by exaggerated laughter, while the third mimicked the guard's movements mockingly. Their classmates gasped, and some of the teachers immediately reached forward to pull them back, but it was too late. The guard stopped. The silence shattered with the sound of his heel striking the pavement as he came to an abrupt halt. The rifle moved from his shoulder with a swift, practiced motion, and his voice cut through the air like a thunderclap. "It is requested," he barked, each word crisp, powerful, and unwavering, "that everyone maintain a level of silence and respect." The students froze. The laughter died instantly. Even the birds seemed to stop their song. The boys who had been so sure of themselves moments ago now stood pale, their smirks gone, their bravado crumbling in the face of discipline unlike anything they had ever known. But the guard was not done. He fixed his gaze directly on the boys, his expression unshaken, his posture unbending. He did not shout in anger, nor did he need to. His presence alone carried the weight of countless generations of sacrifice. The boys felt it, not just in their ears, but in their hearts. The teachers pulled the students back, apologizing profusely, but the damage had already been done. Everyone who witnessed the moment knew it would leave an imprint that could not be erased. The guard resumed his march as if nothing had happened, each step measured, each movement precise. The boys watched him, their faces no longer mischievous but haunted by the gravity of what they had done. For the first time in their young lives, they understood what it meant to stand before something greater than themselves. Afterward, as the group walked away, the other students whispered about what had just happened. Some were angry at the boys for nearly dishonoring the sacred ground. Others were simply stunned into silence. The teachers gathered the three troublemakers aside, their voices low but firm, reminding them of where they were and why respect mattered here more than anywhere else. But none of it was needed. The boys had already been humbled in a way words could not accomplish. Later, one of the boys admitted quietly to his teacher, "I didn't know. I thought it was just like a show." The teacher looked at him and said, "It's not a show. It's a promise. These soldiers guard the unknown, so no one is forgotten. They're not here to entertain. They're here to remind us what sacrifice means." That night, back at their hotel, the boys were unusually quiet. They didn't joke or wrestle like they usually did. Instead, they sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. For the first time, they began to reflect. What had seemed funny hours earlier now felt shameful. They talked among themselves about how the guard never flinched, how he never broke character, how even when confronted with disrespect, he carried himself with an honor they couldn't comprehend. And slowly, something changed inside them. They began to realize that respect isn't just about rules or authority. It's about recognizing that some things are bigger than you. Some things deserve reverence, whether you understand them fully or not. Years later, one of those boys, now a grown man, returned to Arlington. He stood once again before the tomb of the unknown soldier, but this time he stood alone, quietly, his hands folded. In front of him, he watched the guard march in silence, and memories of that day flooded back. He felt a lump in his throat, a deep sense of gratitude, and a bit of shame for his younger self. But more than that, he felt a lesson had been etched into his soul that respect, once learned, never leaves you. The guard walked his 21 steps, paused, pivoted, and walked again. The man watched with tears in his eyes, whispering softly to himself, "Thank you." No one around him heard it, but in his heart, he knew that moment had come full circle. The boy who once mocked had grown into a man who understood, and it was all because of a single soldier who refused to be moved by disrespect, who stood firm in the face of immaturity, and who carried out his duty with unshakable honor. The lesson that day was not just for three boys, it was for everyone who witnessed it and for everyone who hears this story. That respect is not demanded, it is earned. And once earned, it is carried in silence, in discipline, and in the unwavering steps of those who guard what cannot be forgotten. The lesson that day was not just for three boys, it was for everyone who witnessed it and for everyone who hears this story. That respect is not demanded, it is earned, and once earned, it is carried in silence, in discipline, and in the unwavering steps of those who guard what cannot be forgotten. As the bus rolled away from Arlington, the chatter that usually filled the seats after a school trip was replaced by an unusual quiet. The students stared out the windows, their minds circling back to what they had just seen. For many of them, the image of that soldier's sharp voice echoing across the tomb plaza was something they could not shake. It wasn't just that he spoke, it was how he spoke, with a conviction so absolute it cut through every layer of immaturity and distraction. The three boys sat near the back, slouched in their seats, each of them lost in thought. For once, they weren't joking or shoving each other. One of them traced his finger absent mindedly against the fogged window, while another sat with his arms folded tightly, his face tense, as if trying to process a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. Their teacher, Mrs. Sanders, walked down the aisle of the bus and stopped near them. She looked at the boys with a mix of disappointment and concern. "Do you know why that soldier reacted the way he did?" she asked quietly. The boys avoided her gaze at first, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, one of them mumbled, "Because we were being disrespectful." Mrs. Sanders nodded, but her voice was gentle. "Yes, but it's deeper than that. Those men and women who serve as tomb guards give everything to uphold a promise that no unknown soldier will ever be forgotten. They dedicate years of their lives to this duty, training through blistering heat, freezing cold, and sleepless nights so they can march in perfect precision. They guard the tomb 24 hours a day, every day of the year, no matter what. And they do it silently, without ever expecting thanks. When you mocked him, you weren't just mocking a man in a uniform, you were mocking the sacrifice of thousands who will never come home. Her words landed heavy. The boys lowered their heads, their faces flushed with guilt. One of them whispered, barely audible, "We didn't know." Mrs. Sanders sat down beside them and sighed. "I believe you. But ignorance is no excuse for disrespect. You've been given a gift today, a chance to see what real honor looks like. Don't waste it." The rest of the bus ride passed in near silence. For the boys, the lesson was not an easy one, but it was unforgettable. They would carry it with them in ways they didn't yet understand. That evening, back at the hotel, the group gathered for dinner in the lobby. The teachers expected chatter and laughter, but instead found the students subdued, reflective. When the trip leader asked for volunteers to share what they had learned that day, a surprising hand went up. It was one of the boys. He stood awkwardly in front of his classmates, his voice trembling at first. "I thought the guard was just, marching around like part of a show." But he wasn't. He was he was honoring people we'll never know, people who died for us. And I realize now that what we did was wrong, really wrong. He paused, his throat tight, then added softly, "I think I'll remember his voice for the rest of my life." The room was still. Even the teachers, who had been angry with the boys only hours earlier, felt a wave of compassion wash over them. They knew this was a moment of growth, a seed planted that might one day shape the kind of men these boys would become. Years passed. The boys grew older, and life pulled them in different directions. High school came with new challenges: sports, friendships, family struggles. Yet that moment at Arlington remained etched into their memories. Whenever they felt tempted to mock, to disrespect, or to brush off something sacred, they remembered the sound of that guard's command and the silence that followed. One of the boys, Michael, carried the lesson with particular weight. He had always been quick to laugh at others, to use cruelty as a shield against his own insecurities. But after Arlington, he began to change. He still joked and still laughed, but he thought twice before tearing someone else down. In history class, when they studied World War II and the Vietnam War, he found himself lingering on the stories of soldiers whose names were never known. He thought about how many of them rested beneath the white stones of Arlington, their families left without closure, their identities lost to time. And he thought about the guard who stood watch for them day and night with footsteps that never faltered. By the time Michael graduated, he had decided to pursue a path of service. He didn't tell many people why. It was too personal, too profound to put into simple words. But deep down, he knew it traced back to that day when he tried to trip a soldier and was instead tripped by the weight of honor itself. On the day he left for basic training, he told his mother the truth. "Do you remember that field trip to Arlington in 8th grade?" he asked. She nodded, recalling how quiet he had been afterward. "That was the day I realized what sacrifice really means. I want to spend my life doing something that matters, something bigger than myself." That soldier, he didn't move, he didn't flinch, but he changed me forever. His mother, with tears in her eyes, hugged him tightly. She understood. Michael never became a tomb guard, but he carried the spirit of what he had witnessed into every aspect of his service. He learned discipline, resilience, and the meaning of standing firm in the face of adversity. And though he never wore the distinctive badge of the old guard, he honored them by embodying the lesson they had taught him. Respect, silence, and sacrifice are more powerful than arrogance, noise, or pride. One day, many years later, Michael returned to Arlington as a veteran. He walked slowly to the tomb of the unknown soldier, his heart pounding with a mix of reverence and memory. He stood at the railing just as he had as a boy, but now with a deeper understanding. The guard marched before him, every step as flawless as it had been that day so long ago. Michael stood tall, his hands folded in front of him, and whispered under his breath, "Thank you." It wasn't just for the unknown soldiers lying beneath the tomb. It was for the guard who had once stopped in his tracks and spoken with a voice that shook a boy out of his immaturity and into a lifetime of respect. And as he turned to leave, Michael glanced at a group of students visiting on their own field trip. Among them, he saw a boy whispering, snickering, nudging his friends. Michael smiled softly, knowing that perhaps one day that boy too would learn a lesson he'd never forget. Michael took a few steps away, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the faint echo of boots against stone, that steady rhythm that carried through the quiet air. Maybe it was memory, how that same sound had once jolted him out of his arrogance and into humility. Whatever it was, he turned back and watched the new group of students gather near the marble railing. The boy who had been laughing earlier was now mimicking the guard's stiff posture, his friends giggling behind him. Michael could almost see himself in that young face, the careless grin, the restless energy, the ignorance that comes with thinking the world exists only for you. He hesitated, then walked back toward them. The teacher guiding the group looked up, surprised at first, but her expression softened when she saw the veteran's uniform and the humility in his stance. "Excuse me," Michael said quietly, his voice steady but kind. "Would you mind if I spoke to them for just a moment?" The teacher nodded, sensing something important in his tone. Michael turned to the students, his eyes gentle but firm. "You know," he began, "I once stood exactly where you're standing now. I laughed too. I didn't understand what this place really meant. But this isn't just a ceremony, it's a promise. A promise that even those who never came home, who don't have a name, will still be honored and remembered. That's what that guard is doing. Every step he takes is a way of saying, you are not forgotten." The boys shifted uneasily, their smirks fading. One of them glanced at the guard and then back at Michael, unsure what to say. Michael smiled softly. "You might not understand it yet. I didn't, not at your age, but someday you will. Maybe when you've lost someone you care about. Maybe when you learn what real sacrifice looks like. Just remember this moment when you do." The teacher thanked him quietly, and Michael nodded before turning away. He didn't need to say more. The guard's precise steps filled the silence once again, each one echoing through the cold morning air. As he walked down the path lined with white headstones, Michael felt a familiar peace settle over him. The wind brushed through the trees, and the soft rustle of leaves sounded almost like whispered prayers. He stopped for a moment, closing his eyes, letting the memories of faces and voices long gone pass through him. He thought of the three boys he once called friends, how that moment had changed each of them in different ways. One had joined the fire department, dedicating his life to saving others. Another had become a teacher, determined to help young minds grow with empathy instead of pride. And Michael, who had once mocked what he didn't understand, had found his life's purpose in honoring what was greater than himself. He knelt before one of the graves and placed a small medal he had carried for years upon the stone. The name was unfamiliar, but that didn't matter. "You don't know me," he whispered, "but I owe you more than you'll ever know." The air felt heavier then, not with sadness, but with gratitude. As he rose, he noticed an elderly man watching him from a bench nearby. The man wore a faded jacket adorned with a few medals of his own. He gave Michael a slow nod, one veteran to another, bound not by words but by shared understanding. Michael walked over and sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was sacred. Finally, the old man said, "First time back?" Michael nodded. "First time since I was a kid." The old man smiled faintly. "The first time's always the hardest. The next time, It's like coming home. They sat there as the guard continued his silent vigil. The sound of his boots against the stone carried across the courtyard like the heartbeat of the place. Every precise turn, every polished movement was a language of its own, one of duty, devotion, and memory. When the changing of the guard ceremony began, the two men stood. Michael removed his cap and held it over his heart. The old man straightened his spine, his wrinkled hand trembling slightly as he saluted. Together they watched as the relief commander inspected the new sentinel's weapon, the steel gleaming beneath the muted sun. The movements were ritualistic, exact, but far from mechanical. They were alive with meaning. As the ceremony ended, Michael felt tears sting his eyes, not because of sorrow, but because of the quiet strength that filled the space. He realized that no matter how many generations passed, the flame of respect would never truly die, not as long as men like these stood guard. Walking away, he passed a small group of tourists, speaking in hushed tones, their cameras lowered out of respect. One of them turned and asked him softly, "Were you one of them?" The guards, Michael smiled. "No, but one of them changed my life." The tourist looked puzzled, but before he could ask more, Michael simply nodded and kept walking. Some lessons, he thought, don't need to be explained, they just need to be felt. Later that night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cemetery was bathed in the orange glow of twilight, Michael stood at the gates one last time. The day had faded, but the tomb of the unknown soldier remained illuminated, a single guard pacing in eternal rhythm. Michael watched him for a long while, his heart full. He whispered to himself, "Some heroes never speak, they just march." Then he turned and walked away into the quiet evening, carrying with him not only the memory of that guard's unbroken stride, but the lesson that true strength is not in defiance, it is in devotion. And somewhere, beyond the rows of white stones, beyond the boundaries of time and memory, the echoes of those footsteps continued, steady, measured, and eternal.